Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with me, Daddy Noy. And today we're diving into one of the most mysterious, beautiful, and often overlooked ancient writings. Now, we have looked at the first two chapters, and now we're going to look at the third chapter of the first book of Enoch. In this text, though not part of most biblical canons today, was once treasured by many early Jewish Christians and many early Jewish communities, and even quoted directly in the New Testament. So now you might be wondering if it's so important, why was it removed? Well, First Enoch is part of a group of writings called the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha. These are ancient Jewish works written roughly between 300 BC and the 1st century BC, or CE, excuse me. That didn't make it into the Holy Bible or later that standardized canon. So the reasons are layered. In Jewish tradition, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, leaders at places like Germania began consolidating which texts would define the faith going forward. Enoch, in its vivid angelology, complex visions, and at times very direct messianic prophecies, didn't quite fit the direction of post-temple Judaism. In early Christianity, certain church fathers valued it, but as the institutional church grew, they too narrowed the canon, focusing on books that supported the uniform theology. First Enoch, cosmic battles, heavenly journeys, and radical depictions of divine judgment just felt too speculative for them. And yet, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, First Enoch remains fully canonical to its day, to this day today, a living testimony to its ancient authority in some branches of faith. So when we study it today, we aren't just reading a forgotten curiosity. We're stepping into the worldview of the Jewish people during the centuries leading up to Jesus. This is the soil out of which the early Christianity grew and most likely influenced Jesus deeply. Before we get to chapter 3, let's remember where we've been. Chapter 1 opened with a blessing of prophecy of Enoch, declaring God's coming judgment of the Watchers, those rebellious angels who descended to earth. Chapter 2 reminded humanity to look at creation and see the testimony of the Creator's order. And now, chapter 3 continues in that same tone, using nature as the witness to God's unchanging law. Now let's read the text from the public domain, Richard Lawrence's 1883 translation, which stays close to the ancient Ge'etz manuscript tradition. So it's First Enoch chapter 3. Now, it is extreme. This is probably the shortest chapter you'll ever read in a text, in a sacred text. So here we go. First Enoch chapter 3 from the Lawrence translation. Observe and see how, quote, in the winter, unquote, parenthetically, all the trees seem as though they had withered and shed all their leaves, except 14 trees, which do not lose their foliage, but retain the old foliage from 2 to 3 years, till the new comes. Now for the deep dive commentary on First Enoch chapter 3. That's the whole chapter. The chapter 3 may be short, but it is packed with meaning, especially when we read it in its ancient, cultural, and theological context. On the surface, it's simply an observation about trees in the winter, how most lose their leaves, but a few retain evergreen. But in Enoch's symbolic and apocryphic framework, even nature is a moral teacher, revealing truths about God's order, judgment, and mercy. 1. The evergreen symbol in ancient cultures. In the ancient Near East, evergreen trees, particularly cedars, palms, and certainly species of olive, were powerful symbols. To the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, the cedar of Lebanon represented resilience and divine blessing. In Israelite poetry, we see similar imagery. Psalms 92:12 says, quote, the righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon, unquote. Evergreen trees endure through the quote, death of winter, standing as living metaphors for those who remain faithful through times of trial. Now, in the context of First Enoch, These 14 trees that do not lose their foliage could reflect a remnant of a faithful group preserved through the spiritual, quote, winter of the world. This echoes later apocalyptic themes where a righteous remnant survives divine judgment to enter God's restored creation. 2. Why 14 trees? The number 14 is intriguing. In Jewish symbolic numerology, 14 is double 7, and 7 represents completeness or divine perfection. Double 7 can imply an intensified completeness, often associated with covenant or promise. In Second Temple literature, numbers are rarely accidental. They carry theological weight. Some scholars like Lauren Stuckbrook, suggest that the 14 trees might point to the completeness of God's preserved people, possibly mirroring the 12 tribes plus a symbolic addition of leadership or priesthood, rounding out the idea of a fully preserved community. And 3, agricultural knowledge in the Second Temple period. What's fascinating here is that Enoch's author clearly understands seasonal architecture in the Levant. In that climate, most deciduous trees lose their leaves in the cool, rainy winter months. But certain species such as olive, carob, and evergreen oak maintain foliage year-round. This attention to detail grounds First Enoch in lived reality. It's not just an abstract mysticism. It's theology rooted in observation of the actual land. Agriculture was central to Israelite identity. The rhythm of planting and harvest, the cycles of rain and drought were all tied to the covenant blessings and curses in the Torah. In Deuteronomy, obedience to God brings the early and latter rains. Disobedience brings drought. By drawing attention to the trees, the text ties human morality to the very fabric of creation. And 4, nature as a witness in Jewish wisdom literature. This use of nature to instruct humanity is consistent with Jewish wisdom tradition. Proverbs, Job, and Psalms all point to creation as a testimony of God's character. In First Enoch, this principle is amplified. The cycles of nature are not just evidence of God's existence, but of his consistency and his coming justice. The evergreens stand as living proof that life can persist through death like seasons. Aaron Abke often speaks about how ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature uses symbolic imagery to awaken the heart. That the goal isn't just to pass on information, but to invite transformation. Here, the evergreen tree becomes a meditative image. Who are we in the winter seasons of life? Are we like the withering trees, losing our spiritual vitality, or like the 14 evergreens, steadfast with the renewal until the renewal comes? And 5, theological implications in the Enoch worldview. In the Enoch world corpus, nature is not morally neutral. It participates in God's plan. The righteous are in harmony with creation while the wicked disrupt it. The Watchers, by corrupting humanity and teaching forbidden arts, also corrupted the natural order. In that worldview, the resilience of the evergreens might signal not just divine preservation, but also resistance to the corruption unleashed by the Watchers. This is consistent with Dr. James Tabor's observation that First Enoch is, at its heart, about restoring the original Edenic order. The evergreen trees may be a visual callback to Eden's tree of life, which in Jewish thought was never seasonal, never, quote, dead for part of the year, but always full of life. And 6, cross-cultural parallels anthropologically. Anthropologically, we find similar imagery across cultures. In ancient Egypt, the Persea tree was sacred to the gods and symbolized eternal life. In Mesopotamia, the date palm represented fertility and abundance. Across the Mediterranean, evergreens were associated with deities of life, rebirth, and the underworld. These cross-cultural parallels remind us that Enoch's audience lived in a symbolic world where nature constantly spoke out of the divine. And 7, of course, application for the ancient reader. For a Second Temple Jew hearing this text, the message would be both comforting and challenging. Comforting because God preserves a faithful remnant through times of spiritual winter. Challenging because the question is implicit: will you be among the evergreens, or will your faith wither when the seasons turn harsh? Now for a few closing reflections. As I reflect on this chapter, I'm struck by how simple and yet how profound it is. One verse, one image, and yet it opens up a universe of meaning. That's the beauty of apocalyptic literature. It teaches in layers. On the surface, a description of trees, and beneath, a call to steadfastness. Deeper still, a reminder of God's unshakable covenant with his people. And maybe that's the takeaway for us. Life has winters, faith has winters, but God preserves his people through them. Like those 14 trees, we are called to endure, not by our own strength, but because the life of God within us does not wither. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What does the image of the evergreen say to you? Drop a comment and share your reflections, and let's keep learning together. Thank you again for sharing this time with me today and looking at the book of Enoch. Next week, I'll be back with another chapter of Enoch. I'll continue this, and I'll do more other apocryphal texts like the Didache, and possibly some other texts too, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the fragments. I think all of these texts are worth, maybe even the Bhagavad Gita, and then other rich spiritual texts from other traditions that have a lot of meaning for us today. So thank you for joining me for this, and we will see you in the next chapter tomorrow.